up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Digital Artcast. I am so psyched about today's episode. We have an amazing guest on, and yeah, just the general stuff that's been going on with the podcast. I'm really glad that we're nearly 2,000 subs. Of course, Patreon's been launched and a couple of other things. Always check in the description if you want to find out more about the podcast. And yeah, without further ado, let me introduce today's guest. Someone I've been wanting to talk to for a while, Ms Allison Perry. So say hi, Allison.
Hi.
So Allison, yeah, thank you for coming on and speaking to me. I know we tried to arrange it for a bit and just trying to find a gap where we were both kind of free, but you managed to find an hour in your day to come talk to us. So thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, cool. So small accolade that I've kind of also kind of threw your way that you know about, that you're the second ever female artist we've had on the podcast. Of course, not by choice, but yeah, it's great to have another perspective in the podcast to talk about art. And then yeah, definitely, it's been great just seeing your history of work, having such a kind of talented and well-rounded artist, just to talk about the industry in general, because I feel like yeah, there's a lot we can delve into, yeah, given your the span of your career. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully this will start a wave of more females to join the podcast soon.
Yes, definitely. Feel free for anybody who wants to come on. Let me know, because yeah, definitely I want to have a lot more diversity on this podcast.
Yeah.
100%. So you've had an amazing career. Anyone who don't even just sit on your Facebook for 2 minutes would see just the accolades that you've had, and the kind of careers that or jobs that you've been in the last couple of years. So where did that start? Of course, if no one really knows who you are by name, and shame on you, you should. Could you give us a kind of brief rendition of what you're doing at the moment and your kind of your job title?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Allison Perry, like you said earlier. And I actually didn't start studying art. I feel like this is, some people's stories as well. And I started studying English, actually. I wanted to be an English teacher.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I know. Kind of weird, right?
No, yeah. Well, I was an engineer before I came into art, so, I've had a career up until I was 28 and then left and went back to university. So, yeah, I had other aspirations for my life, but that changed. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really like to emphasize that, because I want people to know that, like, if they want to make a career change later in their life, it is possible. And I think a lot of people think that if they don't make that change, like at like 22 or something absurdly young like that they're not allowed to change. And it's like, no, you can do it.
Yeah. Well, I was 28, so yeah.
Yeah, I was how old was I when I had just graduated from, like, I guess, regular academic college at, I think, 22. Yeah, 22. And I realized that, English, being a teacher doesn't pay super duper well. And I was in a lot of student loan debt. So I just figured, hey, if I'm going to be in a bunch of debt, I might as well do what I actually want to do instead of, like, compromising. So I ended up going to Art Center for 4 years, but not actually graduating, which a lot of people were probably like, why didn't you graduate? And I'm like, well, I had one more term, but I had a job offer at a VR game startup. And I was just like, well, I already have a degree, even though it's not in the field that I want to work in. So, I got that checkbox checked. I might as well start getting paid instead of paying to learn. So I ended up dropping out, and I don't regret it. I worked there for a year. I did some freelance while I was there. I worked at Snapchat, or Snap. It's actually just called Snap Inc. For a year and a half. And now I'm at Skydance Animation. And between that, I just did a bunch of freelance, which is where a lot of my experience comes from. I think that's true for a lot of people, honestly. So I've freelanced a lot of, like, TV animation, games, commercial.
Yeah, because you've done work with, like, Nickelodeon, Disney, Riot Games. They're all kind of people that you have done stuff for in the past, right?
Yeah, and I mean, that's kind of the benefit of freelance, is you get a ton of experience with a ton of people, with a ton of teams, all in a really short amount of time a lot of the time. because a lot of the time they're just bringing someone on to like fill a gap or fill a quick need. So like,
Yeah.
you're not getting that cool in-house experience, which I totally understand. Some people want that. And I mean, I want that for my like full-time work,
Yeah.
but on the side, you're getting all this like really, colorful experience that, you can't get at a full-time job. So definitely recommend freelance. So yeah.
Yeah. I think especially when you're starting, it will be a good entry point because, like you said, you get so much experience so quickly. But then if you're relying on your kind of 9 to 5 just job at, like at one defined studio doing one defined thing, then you will grow, but not as exponentially as if you were doing freelance work, which is, different projects, different speeds, different teams. So yeah, I think it's definitely a good way to start in the industry is to get your feet wet in different areas really quickly. I'm sure you would agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually, a lot of people ask like, oh, do you have to have an internship to get a job? And like, I actually never had an internship. And I always recommend to people that either don't have the resources to do an internship, can't get an internship, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, should, attempt to get some freelance, because I kind of consider that to be my like, equivalent experience, because, it's a short sort of experience with a company where you get
Mm-hmm.
to know their team, know their pipeline.
Yeah.
And the benefit is that freelance oftentimes pays better than internships. So
Yeah, yeah, because you're not getting the added benefits of the employee stuff, so they're kind of paying you, pro rata stuff. But
yeah.
yeah, no, totally 100%. I think that is a good. I think it's more commonplace with games. Well, where I'm looking at games anyway, or even just other CG studios I've seen where, because the bar is so high, right? Because so many people want to do this job, and they always just look for the best. The freelance stuff is a good way to say, especially coming in an interview, that yeah, look, I've worked with a team, I've worked on a pipeline, I have done a project to completion, so you can rely on me. Because yeah, coming in without any of that experience in any other studios, then people would kind of be like, oh well, how well would they adapt to our team? How well would they mix? Which also comes, I think, part and parcel with networking as well, right? Because that also shows that you're keen if you're catching up with people at GDC, or you're hitting up recruiters at different events, and they kind of get to know your face and know that you've done stuff. So because you wanted to touch on that, right? Like, I take it was networking something that you were focusing on as you were at Art Center.
Actually, funny thing is, I didn't network at all really at Art Center except towards the end, which is something I super regret.
Yeah,
And it's funny that you bring up like cons and like conferences and stuff like GDC and stuff, because I've
yeah.
actually never been to one. I went to except
Wow.
E3 once, but
Okay.
it was after I got a job, and I literally stayed there for like 30 minutes, and it was so
Yeah.
crowded, and I was just like, I'm out. I can't do
Uh,
it.
yeah, people keep telling me the crowds at E3 are just panic and anxiety inducing because there's so many people there now, because it's open to the public now for the
Yeah.
last couple of years, so it's just there's so many people there. And one of my friends is actually a news editor for a games kind of blog thing, but he's trying to do his job, interview people and test games out, but he's having to wait at the queue of a million Joe averages who are just there to just take pictures and selfies and stuff, and check out new games. But oh god, yeah, E3. So, but I think again, you're talking about the networking stuff, and you didn't do a lot of it. But I think it's also like a double-edged sword as well, because you're in LA, like you're in the heart of a lot of that industry. So although you didn't maybe network, you were in the kind of the beating heart of the industry. Did you feel like that helped you, like being situated in Los Angeles?
I mean, it's kind of hard to say, since I don't have a comparison point on it. Like, I think
Yeah.
honestly, before I started, like when I was still in college, I didn't really realize what a privilege it was to live in LA, because I
Mm.
just everyone I knew lived here, and I lived here, so I just assumed that this was everyone's experience. And at Art Center, I met a lot of people that came from overseas or came from out of state, and just
Mm.
talking to them really opened up my eyes to what a privilege it is to live here. I mean, there are definitely downsides, like the cost of living being astronomical,
Oh yeah, yeah.
but I can't deny that it puts you close to the people you need to be near. But at the same time, I think it's really easy to just assume that that's all you need to do, because like that's sort of what I was doing in college. Was there was sort of this culture at my college that you should let your work speak for itself, and that you should be on campus all the time, not networking because, oh, your work's going to be so great that you're not going to need a network. And so, I was in the LA scene, but I wasn't really going out much. I can't really say if just ambiently being in LA helped. It probably did, but I think that you're better off spending some time in college networking. Maybe going to like not conferences necessarily, but like networking events. They do exist, and also just putting yourself out there online. I see a lot of students putting their work online in like really inefficient ways, which I don't want to like police how anyone manages their social media, because ultimately it's up to you. It's your social media, but if you're trying to get eyes on your work because, maybe you don't have time to network, maybe you're not living in LA, whatever, you shouldn't drop all your work at like 1 a.m. on a Sunday and then disappear off the internet for 3 months,
Yeah. But I feel like it's also a thing where there's so much reach now, especially with social media, where, I mean, things like 10,000 hours and Level Up also are, sitting there, Facebook groups, stuff you can dive into and throw work in progress or critique stuff, and then become part of that community. You don't even really have to leave your house. If you really didn't want to go out and or you didn't have the money or the funds to travel or do other things, there is a possibility you can use online forums and facilities to gain feedback, to network, to meet people. I mean, some of my first industry people I knew, I just added people on Facebook, not maliciously. I think the first couple of people that I didn't know too well, I would send them a quick message and say, hey, I think one of them was Matt Gazer, and I said, hey, Matt, I'm a big fan of your work. I really love your stuff. I think we spoke in email previously. I'd really love to talk to you a bit more. Would it be okay if I added you? And then from there, as you start building mutual people that, people have in common on Facebook, you can start reaching out to other people and then making more friends. And then, of course, I've found that, people, especially artists on Facebook, are super willing, if you're polite enough, of course, to give feedback and advice, as long as you've got, sensible questions to ask them and you're quite patient with their time. That's another avenue. So you wouldn't have to necessarily only be going out to events on foot. You can do things online that would enhance your networking without having to focus on going to big events. So yeah
absolutely. I actually think that some of the big events, I mean, I don't really know what the marketing of GDC is like. It might be a little different, but at least in animation there's a lot of, I don't want to name names or disparage anybody, but there are a lot of conventions that purport themselves to be these like, oh, if you go here you'll get a job. And I think that sort of marketing is really predatory. And I think a lot of people think that they have to spend, hundreds, thousands of dollars to travel to some LA con with a bunch of prints. And then, it essentially is just throwing it all into a hole, and, they don't get a job. And I feel really, really bad for them. I think you can get that same experience through either free events, which are, a little harder to find, but they're there. Or just, being really active on social media. I think it's really important that you touched on in what you were just saying, making friends. I think a lot of people expect networks to be like immediately reciprocal and like, oh, I'm unemployed, so I'm going to add a whole bunch of people and ask them for jobs. And like, I don't think that's a good strategy. I think like a lot of the best, I guess, connections that I have are people that are just friends, or like people I added and have, been friends with by interacting with their content in a genuine way. And, I'm unemployed and they're like, oh, hey, I know something. Or they're unemployed and I'm like, oh, here, I heard about this job lead. And, it's kind of this back and forth thing, but you got to give it time. You can't just, oh, I'm unemployed. Hey, everybody, get me a job, please.
I think it's just as also if you're putting your work out there and people then see it and know the caliber of stuff that you can produce. I know back in, I think it was only in February, March, I was kind of pushing hard on some 3D stuff I was doing. And one of the guys I knew that I'd added through an event from Powerhouse Animation was like, yo, we're starting another series down here. We're looking for people to do fantasy style interior stuff or environment stuff. You should really apply. I think your stuff would, and that opportunity just came through knowing that person online. through a mutual friend, and then he kind of reached out and said that I should apply for a gig. And like you said, this stuff just comes a lot of times through word of mouth. Most of the higher ups I know who will hire in senior positions will always speak to other seniors at the time and say, "Yo, do you know someone for this gig? Do you think you would know someone that could come in and do really well?" And if you already have a rapport with somebody and have a good reputation, then yeah, a lot of the senior roles do go to people through word of mouth. So it definitely is worth building that network up, because it will pay off dividends when it comes to finding work.
Yeah, I think that and I think having been sort of on both sides of that, I mean, I've never been like a lead that's like literally looking for people, but I've been in a position where someone has asked me like, "Oh, hey, do you know someone that would be a good for this role?" Or like a lot of companies literally have a an infrastructure for recommending or referring candidates, and I know to a lot of young professionals, myself included, when I was starting out, that can sound really frustrating, like, "Oh wow, that's just nepotism, it's not fair, like I have to know someone to get in," and I get that frustration. But at the same time, if you think of it from a studio's perspective, especially with the internet, the candidate pools are just like a crazy gigantic. And
Yeah,
one of the most important things next to, or if not, on the same par as your portfolio, is, are you okay to work with? Like, are you a nice team member? Which
yeah,
is really, really hard to quantify and evaluate outside of an interview, which takes a lot of time,
yeah.
takes longer than, just looking at someone's portfolio for 30 seconds.
Mhm.
So if they get an employee referral, the assumption is that that's already out of the way. And, no one's going to refer someone they don't like hanging out with.
Yeah,
So it just makes sense to
yeah,
take employee referrals, and I feel like if you understand it from that perspective, it can sort of temper the resentment that you might feel. Because I definitely understand being on the outside, feeling like you're like locked out and you can't get in. It
yeah.
sucks.
I know. I think especially once you leave post graduation, where I'm finding now, having I graduated last year, I'm still in that zone of like I'm working, but I'm not like where I want to be. Especially not like a full time gig where it's like a Monday to Friday. I'm going into an office, I'm doing work on a team with a specific pipeline with art directors. It's just work where I can get it right now, and every so often I'll get a gig that'll be a paycheck that'll keep me going to the next one. Um, but yeah, post graduation is always difficult. It's an interesting kind of minefield where, especially for me, when I left university, I had a kind of skill gap that, because I went to a very generalized university program, it wasn't even really specifically tailored to one thing. So when I left, there was a huge gap in my skills, which I've spent the last year basically trying to fill. But for a lot of people, yeah, I understand. Unless you're going to, like the bigger schools like Art Center or a lot of places in California, it can be a struggle once you leave university and you're kind of like, what next? Like, where do I go? What do I do? Who do I talk to? What studio should I be looking at? Yeah, it is very scary. But then again, you probably again had a different experience because you had a job like before you even finished. So it's difficult, I think, in the way to compare, because most people I typically would speak to would say, yeah, I left school and then I had to do like a couple of freelance gigs and then I had to travel and do something else. And so you were kind of, I'm not going to say lucky, because that sounds like you didn't really do anything. Of course, you were working very hard and you had really good work, but you had a good opportunity, probably more say at the end of your course, that not a lot of people would typically have, especially from my school. Last year there was only like I had a gig doing a 2D game at the time, doing 2D concept stuff, and one guy went straight to Axis in Glasgow and he was doing CG stuff, but everybody else, as far as I know, isn't working in the industry. So yeah, I think it's networking plays a huge part for it, and so does your work, but it's a really weird place to be, right? Like to put yourself out there and try to find work straight away.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said you don't want to call it luck, but honestly, like luck is. I mean, I usually say it's timing because it sounds a little less like oh, like you were just lucky. But
Yeah.
it is a factor, and I actually tell people that like the three factors that must align to get a job are your skills, so like your portfolio or whatever,
Yeah.
um, your network, so someone knowing that you exist, because no
Hmm.
amount of skill really matters if nobody knows it exists,
Yeah.
and just timing. Like you can be I remember one of the most frustrating things when I was looking for work is hearing from people like, oh yeah, your portfolio is really great, you'd totally be a great like candidate for our team. And you'd be like, well, can you get me a job then? And they're like, no, we don't have any like openings right now. And like,
Ah,
that's, oh, it's so annoying and
yeah.
infuriating and frustrating. But as
Mm,
far as like getting a job right out of college, I think having done the college experience prior, like having,
yeah.
just known what college is like, I really looked at college like a subscription service, which I'd
Yeah.
recommend people do, especially with art college, where like you're there to collect skills until you don't want to collect them anymore. So it's kind of
Yeah.
almost like I think that's how schoolism works too. I'm not really sure because I've never used any of those services, but I imagine
Yeah.
they're more subscription based. And I realized like halfway through, like I could probably get paid to get these skills rather than pay for them.
Yeah.
So I started really aggressively applying to jobs.
Hmm.
And I had done some freelance while I was in school, which I think
Hmm.
helped me get that job at the end. And I think a lot of students feel like they're not allowed to look for work until they graduate or until they're in their graduating term, which is
Mm,
why I think a lot of people struggle to get work um, when they graduate is they didn't start really the process until like 3 months ago or whatever. And
yeah.
like no matter how good your skills are, a lot of companies are just like super slow, and like it might take 3 months to process your application or something,
Yeah.
so I would just advise people to start sooner than later. Don't wait for permission, and don't wait for like to be quote good enough, because
Yeah.
trust me, you're never going to feel good
Good
enough.
enough.
Like you always want to be better than you are.
Oh God, yeah. No, I mean, like one of the things that people kind of took from me from my class was, I mean, I ended up getting an internship at Access Studios in Glasgow.
Hmm.
And when I was there, I was lucky at the time they were working on stuff like Destiny 2 and Dawn of War and League of Legends. And, getting to see that behind the scenes was great. But that all came from a conversation from Industry Workshops 2016, where as I was wandering the kind of show floor, I bumped into their table, the recruitment table, and they're a Scottish-based studio. So as soon as I spoke to them, they were like, "Oh, you're from Scotland?" I says, "Yeah, I'm down here. I'm doing a course in Paisley, which is a city in Scotland." And I said, I'm studying 3D animation. I'm doing 3D stuff just now." And they're like, "Oh, great. Give us your details. We might be in touch at one point." And then from there, I managed to get the position out of a couple of hundred people that had applied. But that came from just a conversation at an event. And then since then, I've went to multiple events around the world. I've tried. I mean, none in America at the moment, but I've pretty much covered Europe and London. Um, and tried to just put my name out there. And I'm lucky, I suppose, in the sense with the podcast and other things and the events I've went to. I'm kind of well known in the industry, although not for my work, which is obviously the gap I'm trying to fill just now. But people have a general sense of who I am. So when I go to events now, especially around Europe, people are like, "Oh yeah, I know Gordon." So luckily, hopefully, when the skill set then rises to meet the networking kind of prowess I have, I'll be able to find some work. So, but yeah, people were definitely like taking an interest in my networking stuff early on because they knew it was affording me opportunities that they weren't seeing at the time. So 100%, yeah, I think students need to be networking as soon as you touch ground on your course. I think it's very important. So yeah.
Yeah, I think especially at art center. I don't know if it's still the same way. I don't want to talk about what it is now because I don't go there anymore. But
Yeah.
there was very much like I said, a let your work speak for itself sort of mentality. And like if you maybe didn't deliver your obscene amount of homework in
Mm.
full because you were at a networking event, you'd get sort of reprimanded and like
Oh, okay.
oh, you think going to a bar with a bunch of professionals is as important as my class. And I
Yeah.
think that discouraged a lot of people from networking, which is a shame because I think a lot of people sort of suffered for it, which is unfortunate. And
Yeah.
honestly, the people who did skip classes and like homework for
Mhm.
networking events oftentimes turned out like to
They
have
were getting
really
the
good luck.
gigs. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, luck for me. I was going to touch on that earlier when you talked about it, but luck for me, I think someone explained it perfectly, is when preparedness meets opportunity. And I think,
Yes, yeah.
yes, I think that's definitely the vibe I was getting from it. But no, I mean, I think Art Centre have a thing where they see networking probably less as a priority, because when they feel people are ready, they will bring the talent to the students. Like, they will, because they have a pool, or they have people teaching who are former students of animation studios or whatever. If they see someone with enough talent, or they see someone in a position where they can work, they will then be, in contact with the studio and say, look, I've got this kid in my class, he's really talented. Might want to give him an opportunity for a test or something. Whereas most schools, the networking is something that, you're relied to get that part of it sorted, because they are too focused on the teaching. But then with Art Centre, Nomon, I think, they have a lot of contacts where they can bring people in and expose the students to them, especially at your end of year shows. Like, they can be like, put your stuff up, and then they have guys come in from, Skydance and Disney and everything else, and have them look at the work. And then if they see somebody that catches their eye, they pass in the business cards. So I know it's a double-edged sword again. It's, like you're saying, it's kind of crappy that people are kind of being reprimanded for wanting to go out and network, but at the same time, I think they take that view because they know they can bring people to them, which I think it should be both, right? You should be able to go out and meet people as well as bringing people in to the studio. So,
I
yeah,
think that that's the optimistic take on it.
yeah,
I that's what I came in believing. And again, I can't speak to everyone's art center experience, and I can't speak to what art center is right now
yeah,
or at a past time. But from my experience, that was sort of the promise,
mm-hmm.
but it wasn't really delivered on, at least not for me, which is
Mm,
why I ended up, you know, it honestly felt a lot like how I was describing those conferences and those conventions where they say that, yeah, we're going to provide the network for you. But I didn't really get that personally. And I
yeah,
felt the same sort of dissatisfaction that you're describing, where, I was like, I wasn't quite getting what I needed to professionally. I do think
yeah,
that Art Center has an extremely competitive, like sort of fundamentals training program. And I don't want to dump on that at all. But,
yeah,
uh, I think that they put a lot of money, much like these cons, into telling you how great a network they'll provide you.
yeah.
And I think that it isn't as often delivered upon as it could be.
Yeah. I think one person's experience is always different from another's, right? Because, some people who went to my course really loved it, and, I didn't not love it, but then I did feel there was areas it was lacking. But then again, yeah, people can go to Art Centre and have a great time, but then also people can go and be like, well, it wasn't 100% for me. And that's totally fine, because everybody's an individual. Everybody has an individualistic taste to what they want out of education. And yeah, I think it's just a case of, if it's not working for you, there should be an option to say that, if you want to go this way and do something different, then 100%. But then, kind of touching on, or moving away from Art Centre, you have
Yeah,
this
yeah, yeah.
gig, and then, what you're doing, I suppose, it's more, I think, Viz Dev. So you're doing more visual development stuff, right, as opposed to concept. Although I know there is a lot of overlap within that whole construct of what concept art is. But with visual development, I think it's more a title within animation. Is that right? I don't know 100% a lot about the Viz Dev process. The last time I kind of looked at the job, I was at a talk at THU last year with Corey Loftus, and he was kind of talking about his process doing stuff for Disney, same with Ryan Lang. So is that the kind of, is it a similar trade you're doing now with your studio?
Yeah, I mean, I from my experience again, I kind of feel like concept art and viz dev are sort of the same skill set, but for a different product.
Yeah.
Where like, in concept art, assuming it's for games, because I mean, I've actually done concept art for animation, which is really confusing, and I'm like, wait, so then what is the difference exactly?
Yeah.
But concept art for games, at least, typically, you're designing for the product being created. So maybe you're thinking about like, how does this gameplay element manifest visually? Like, what does this character's kick animation or whatever look like? While in VizDev for animation,
Hmm.
it's you're designing for the screen. You're not designing for gameplay or for mechanics in a game or whatever. But I'd say it's essentially the same skill set. It's just applied in a different way.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it's interesting when I looked at Corey's talk last year when he was talking about the stuff he'd done on Zootopia, and the detail, I think even just the storytelling he went into within a lot of his pieces was like above and beyond. And I think when you're at that level, I think that's the kind of attention to detail you do need. But I think with VizDev, for me, there's more sometimes storytelling elements in it than there is concept art. I think for concept it can be a rough idea, but then I think with VizDev you're almost fleshing out an entire world straight to, you know, a lot of fine detail. I mean, again, there's a lot of overlap, but yeah, I think with VizDev it always seemed like the more I don't want to say difficult, more intense side of developing an idea, because I remember one image that Coy broke down where it was a sheep bar. It was a bar full of sheep, but then there was stuff like the edges of the pool table were frayed because like sheep nibble and everything, or like they were all kind of standing on the bar instead of sitting on the seats because sheep like to like jump on top of things. So there was like all this extra level of like nuance within his piece that told a story or almost brought that whole scene to life. Something I'm not seeing as much in concept work. I don't know if that's like a fair comparison, but
yeah, I think the idea is when you're doing concept art for a game, the player is kind of making the story, so you don't want to impose too much story on that. And I know this is speaking really generally, but
yeah.
while with a film, you're telling a story. It's not a self insert, like a game is. So. You have more opportunity to design to the story or design to the what the director, whoever, wants to show. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, I'm with you. So I take it from because you're at Skydance now, right? So that's your kind of latest gig, and that's only actually come recently, right? And then the last couple of months.
Yeah. I got laid off from Snap, and then I did a little bit of freelance, and now I'm back on the 9 to 5. So
Okay. Well, that'd be interesting though, because then you've had both sides of the coin. Are you so? Because I think that the 50-50 split in this industry is like literally people who freelance, people who are in studios. Do you feel like you sit in one or the other, or do you feel you can happily do both, or you prefer one or over the other, or?
it's hard to say because I'm personally super paranoid about pigeonholing myself. Like, I'm so terrified of saying like, oh, I just do concept, because I'm so worried that I'm going to miss out on a really cool opportunity that doesn't literally have that job description. Right. So I'll oftentimes just kind of say like, I do whatever it is that you're needing, like whatever that job title is. As long as I mean, I'm not saying I can do everything, but like if I know I can do that job, I'll be like, oh yeah, I'm a that. But I'd say that, that's hard to say because I really genuinely like a lot of things. I think that I'm not as big a fan of working in games because it's very intense. It's very tiring. I mean, animation tends to be a little more worker friendly simply because it has this history with its union. And I mean, like, it seems like games is kind of trying to move towards that with like game workers that unite and stuff.
We can only hope.
yeah, seriously. But just sort of the expectation that your life is like the company at games. I think for some people, they really like that. But for me, I feel kind of uncomfortable about that. And I appreciate that, like, at my current job, as well as my job before to some degree, that there's a respect that like you're going to go home at 5 or 6 or whenever your day ends.
You can have a life outside your job, basically.
Yeah. And I for that reason, I don't really like the games as much right now.
Yeah, I feel that as well as probably part LA as well, because I know a lot of the studios out there can be quite intense. Although I spoke to one of my friends who works at Insomniac, and they were saying that they've actually got quite a decent work-life balance, especially when they were working on Spider-Man. They were supposed to be it wasn't as intense, but yeah, I know that some of the guys at Santa Monica done a lot of late nights, and the guys at Riot, the guys at Blizzard, or have their kind of ticks for working later. So yeah, I think it's a very studio-centric thing. I think I've done a talk a couple of months ago at the university, and I said to a lot of the guys that finding your studio is a big part of what will make you happy as an artist, because Not every studio is the same, so there will be some that will be super intense and work really long hours, but then there'll also be some who respect that you need to leave at a certain time if you've got kids or you've got a family or you just have a life. So I think it will take you a while initially to jump from studio to studio to find one that you will enjoy, but hopefully if the studio's doing well enough, once you find that, then you can kind of, set up shop and settle there. Because it's hard trying to find the passion to tell students and kids to go into this industry and be hopeful when you know there's barriers there, right? There's things set up that will make it difficult to find work, difficult to do work while you're at the studio, difficult to have a life at the start because you're doing so much overtime or proving yourself. So was your first few gigs like that? Like before you found kind of where you are just now, did you find you were kind of burning out a lot at the start, trying to do a lot of work?
Well, I had a lot of guidance from friends and like professionals, I guess, saying that like you need to set boundaries on the work you're going to do because your employer is obviously going to want you to stay at work all day because they're going to get more work out of you for less money. And if they could have their way, that's what they would do. So, that I was very much, and this also came from being older too. Like I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just like, hey, you're paying me for 8 hours. I'm going to work really hard for these 8 hours and then I'm going to go home. And if you expect me to do a bunch of unpaid work, then frankly, like, why would I'm not going to. And if you're going to lay me off for that, then I don't think this is a good fit. Like, I don't think that I want to be here if you don't want to pay me for my labor. Like, I don't think that expecting to get paid should be like a bad thing. And I don't want to encourage people to perpetuate that just because they have the time or the energy. Like I wasn't super overworked at my first job. I mean, it certainly had its own issues, which I don't want to go too much into because I'm not here to disparage anyone, but
of course,
they were pretty respectful. I know that some people did work overtime. And I think that since concept and viz dev or whatever you want to call it, these sort of pre-viz skill sets tend to lie at the beginning of the pipeline. You tend to get crunched a little bit less than like say modeling or animation, which is nice. But if an employer could, they'd love you to work all day. You have to draw that line and say, no, I'm going home at 6, but I'll see you tomorrow. Especially because if you do work, all this unpaid overtime, you're setting a precedent that that's what you're going to do forever. And when you stop, the employer is going to feel sort of, ripped off. In fact, I heard this great story. I'm going to try to like summarize it. I don't know if it's true or not, but I think it's a really great story where there was this guy supposedly working on Avatar, the TV show at Nickelodeon.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And he was hired as like one job. I think it was like background designer or something. And he, had all this free time, wanted to prove himself. So he started doing other people's jobs. And the company thought, oh, wow, we can just, lay people off and have this guy do everything. So, I mean, I don't think he was, people probably didn't like him for that. But again, this is like an urban myth. So I don't want to like say anything specifically about Nickelodeon, but
No.
Yeah. They laid these guys off and then he was doing all this work and then he got a girlfriend and now he's not doing that work anymore. So the lesson there was, don't do things that you're not going to continue doing through your career because you're setting an expectation that that's what you're going to be doing.
Yeah, I think that's a dangerous thing to be doing, is to be overzealous at the start. I mean, you want to prove yourself, of course, but at the same time, you don't want to be setting up what's the word I'm looking for? An unattainable goal that will never be reached, basically, is that you can always do this work 24/7 and never have a rest, never have a day off, and you'll always be perfect and your stuff will always be amazing. Because you're just setting yourself up for a fail there, right? Because perfectionism lives in us all, but if you then personify that straight away, right at the start, then that's almost like you're digging your own grave because you can't maintain that forever. So eventually, that will be to the detriment of you, right? That'll eventually come back to bite you.
Too.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, you want to have an almost balance where you're doing enough work that it inspires other people, but not that it makes them hate you, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And like, you're talking about The years you've done Viz Dev and the years you've done concept and work for different games companies and stuff like that, and it's always an interesting point to talk about, the respect you had in the job, and I think it was something that that I'd want to ask you, but again, it's up to you how much you'd want to go into this. But with you being female in the industry, have you felt that there's been any potential barriers that you came up against, particularly because you were a woman, or that have kind of reared their ugly head in studios that you've overcome, or have you had a good experience that's not really been an issue? Or
I mean, I don't want to. I mean, I'm sure there are people that will say there are barriers, and I'm sure there are barriers that I haven't personally experienced or I was just not aware of. I mean, I think that if you just type into Google like games and like sexism, there will probably be a bazillion articles that will explain it better than I can in
most of
a
them are about
podcast.
Riot at the moment. So yeah,
and I'd say I've experienced challenges, and like if someone asked me if it was harder because of being a woman, I'd say I'm not sure if you've heard this before, but there's this idea that women have to work twice as hard to be taken like just as seriously as men, or half as seriously, or whatever, it's phrased differently. But I've certainly had sort of offhanded experiences where like I'm like that seemed kind of sexist, and like it never like affected my ability to get work or my ability to get my job done, but it was stuff that sort of made me feel uncomfortable. And I'm honestly like sort of like my phone's ringing, oops. Sorry about that.
It's all good.
I'm not as aware of things as I should be. A lot of the time I just get like super fixated on my work, and I don't really think about things until after they occur, where I'm like, hey, that seemed kind of messed up. But I hate saying this, but I think Art Center really, in this respect, did a pretty good job of preparing me, because especially in the department I was in, there were a lot of dudes in my term and in my department. So I kind of got used to navigating that kind of space. And there's also, so here's the nice thing. So before I went to Art Center, I went to Scripps College, which I'm sure you don't know, but that's okay. It was an all-girls college, and it had a focus on sort of feminist studies and gender studies, which at the time I thought was really stupid. And I was like, oh, this is a waste of time. There's no sexism in the world because, I'm at an all-girls school. So of course there isn't. But when I got into the industry and when I went to Art Center, I really found a way to put the things that I learned into use. And that became sort of a vocabulary for me to understand what was going on. And even though that might not give me the power to change it or fix it or whatever, because, oftentimes these things are coming from on high or from a cultural angle, and you as one person can't, fix things tomorrow. But it gave me a way to understand why things are happening and how to sort of not let it get to you. And I'm super grateful now for that experience, even though it was really expensive to, go to a completely different college. It gave me, like I said, a language to understand what's going on and cope with it and navigate it. So this is a really long-winded answer. I'm sorry, but
no.
Yes, being a woman, it does on some level, it is part of your identity, and it's going to affect your experience just like any other. Like, I don't want to make it sound like, struggle only comes in the male-female binary. In fact, I wouldn't even argue that is a binary, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Of course.
But, there's also like a diversity issue. There's not a lot of people of color. There's not a lot of, non-cis, non-hetero people. So like, it's tough for anyone who's on the sort of, what's the word? The fringe of, not being white or male, basically.
No, it's because it tends to be a lot of the positions of power are held by straight white men. So then integrating other people into that category can then be difficult for them because it's also a different perspective from where they've came from. So yeah, it's definitely it's the more you see it in the media, I think it just gets a bit disheartening for people because you see the recent. I'm actually trying to remember the name of it, but I can't remember specifically. It was a guy who'd put a show on Netflix. It's also on YouTube where he talked specifically, done one whole episode about sexism in games, and he talked to a lot of the Riot ex-employees and guys from Telltale and how bad it was to work in the industry. And it's disheartening because there's so many talented people I know that want to go into that field or revisit that field or do more work in there, but then a lot of the studios are off-putting because of the rumors I've heard or things I've seen through media sources. And I think it's the way I've kind of came across it is that a lot of these things really just need to be experienced firsthand, and you have to find out yourself how you feel about the culture or the work ethic, because there will be people who will slate studios and say, X, Y, Z, it's horrible to work there, blah, blah, blah. But then people who have worked there will also be like, no, well, my experience was okay. I didn't have any problems, or, for that particular job, I was okay. I was well paid. I was well treated. I didn't have any issues. So I think for a lot of things, it comes down to a personal preference, and it comes down to you really need to experience that for yourself and then make your own decision based on what you've seen and experienced, if that's the environment you want to be in. I think Riot especially will get a lot of heat just now because they're the big target, because they have so many employees across so many studios across the world. So there can be so many hundreds of instances of different things that happen. But some of the readings from, I think it was one of the original stories that came out about the girl who worked in one of the Dublin offices, and some of the stuff that came out of that was just shocking. It was definitely, I remember going to an event not long after that article was published, and it was one of the main talking points at the time, and a lot of the women I talked to were like, it seems like accurate. It seems, stuff I've experienced or stuff I know that goes on that I've heard about from other female colleagues. So, which sucks, right? Like, it's got to be, how do you then, I suppose, would you want to, but how would you put a positive spin on that to say that, don't let it get you down? Like, you should work in this industry. There isn't as much of it, or is there a positive to be taken from that, do you think?
I mean, there's the angle that like you can be the change that you want to see, which I think is a little optimistic, but maybe not wrong, in the sense that, like, if you have the strength and the wherewithal to be at a, like, I'm not telling people that they need to suffer to change these companies, but if you feel like you can make a small change today in, a meeting or a design or something, then try and do what you can do. Don't push yourself and kill yourself over it, but make the differences you can make, and also just have people in a life outside of school, because not school, sorry, outside of work, because those are the people that you can bounce things off of, get feedback from, not in terms of like your art, but like in terms of how to deal with a situation professionally. And like, maybe it is time to leave the company. Like, if you're going home to your partner every day and being like, oh gosh, my boss is horrible, whether he be sexist or racist or whatever, like, maybe it's time to start looking for other work. Maybe this isn't for you. And I think it's easy to get in a bubble if you don't have anyone outside of this industry or the company you're working at or whatever, where you just normalize it and you're like, oh yeah, I'm treated awfully, but that's just the way it is. And like, you don't want to normalize, either for yourself or the people around you, behavior that you're not comfortable with. And like just celebrating the little differences you can make. Like, I remember we were doing a like sort of a celebrity likeness somewhere. I'll keep it vague, but he was like, the guy we were creating was like sort of heavier set, and like there was a push to make him not, like, to thin him out and make him attractive, but, in quotation marks. And I was like, hey, I think that would reflect really poorly on us if we did that. And I think that we should make an effort to represent him as he is, and like acknowledge that is beautiful, and like that he doesn't need to fit a certain, body to be, beautiful. You know what I mean? And it was a little hard to make that argument to the management at the time, but I think it was a good thing, and it took a little bit of effort on my part, but I had the bandwidth for it, so I'm glad I did it.
No, I definitely think it's it's harder, I think, when you start in the industry and you have no real, I say credentials, or you don't really need credentials to stop racism, but or sexism. But like, what I'm saying is that it might seem intimidating to bring those things up as a negative when you're so young in the company because you want that job, right? If wherever you've got to that point, you're at that studio because you want to be there. You know, either through you like their work or you want to work on the project. So then when things arise that will then irk you in a certain way, whether it be like a comment or something that's happening that you're not too happy with, it's harder, I think, when you're younger, especially, and you're fresh faced and you're right in the door to then put your hand up and say, well, hey, no, I don't agree with this, or I don't think this. I mean, you should be able to do that at any level. If there is a grievance, with your workplace or your work colleagues, you should be able to voice that regardless of how long you've been there. But I think it definitely is harder when you're new. It's definitely harder to voice your opinion when you've not worked on a million projects, or you've not came from a big studio previously, or have a lot of work, because then I think some people feel like, well, if I'm not like a leader, a senior, then where is my voice? Why should I have a voice? Because why would they listen to me because I'm only a junior, whatever. um yeah, do you
I
feel
mean,
that's like right? Or
I think something that, and I mean, maybe I internalized this a little earlier, just being older or something. I don't know, but
yeah,
just arguing it from a business perspective makes it very difficult to argue with. And like sometimes you'll still get shot down, and they'll be like, "Oh, we don't care. We just want to do it the way we want to do it."
right,
In which
yeah,
case, whatever. You can't win
yeah, of
every battle, but
course,
if you make the argument like I tried to with this celebrity thing that we were doing,
yeah,
um, instead of saying like I think and I want, I
yeah,
said, this is going to reflect poorly on our brand if we represent this person in a way that I have a feeling his brand doesn't want him to be represented, and like you argue it from a statistical or like quote logical perspective. And personally, I think that your personal perspective should matter, but sometimes it
yeah,
doesn't.
yeah,
And, money talks to these companies.
yeah, 100%. I think, yeah, that's probably a good way of looking at it, is that if you can make the argument that wouldn't do this particular thing because it will represent or reflect on us really badly as a company, then people can kind of be like, oh shit, yeah, I think you're kind of right there. That might be a bad idea. Then, yeah, there's more weight behind that. So probably it isn't the fact that you couldn't make the argument as a junior, but maybe the way you would phrase it would have to be different than just I
Yeah.
think, or I don't agree with, or so. But then definitely 100%, if there is an issue at your work that you feel that is making you feel uncomfortable for any particular reason, then you should always be able to speak up. And I think that's why also the unionization is also a good idea, because then it also covers that aspect of the industry as well, right? As sexism, racism, not having enough diversity in workplaces, that's all usually covered by union workers, especially stuff like equal pay. So I think it's difficult because, we see it as this huge industry now that's a multi-billion pound or multi-dollar industry. But, at the same time, it's still a young industry, like compared to
Yeah.
the film industry. It's really, really, or animation, it's still really relatively young. So the unionization probably will happen in our lifetimes, but then you'll probably find maybe the next generation of people come in and will find the benefits of that, more than we will, because we've been at the picket fences right at the first front, trying to fight for this stuff, and then eventually it'll come in, and then it will take a while before people start feeling the benefits of it. But um, yeah, it's definitely well needed, because I think not every studio does need it. I have heard some great, I mean, and people who are listening to this, and maybe this is the first time you listen to this episode, don't feel discouraged about entering the industry, because as much as we'll talk about issues that are currently happening within certain studios, it really is certain studios. Not every studio is like this. And of course, I was working at Skydance now, and I have heard positive things about that studio, saying it's a great place to work. So, I think, like I said earlier, it really is about finding the place you want to call home for a while, and finding the place that makes you feel comfortable. And that can take a while, and it can take a lot of moving about. But I wouldn't get discouraged thinking that there's no hope, right? Like there's no way you would want to enter this industry because it's so unbalanced or unbiased. There is positives, and of course, Alison, you've worked for a long time in this industry, doing freelance work and doing work in studios, and I would say your experience has been genuinely positive, right? It's not always been kind of negative. It has more or less been good.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's paying my bills, which is what matters the most, because that's what work is for.
Yes.
But I've had some negative like encounters, but I try to keep on the positive side, just because it sucks if you just leave a job and you're like, wow, that was completely terrible, and like what can you do about it? Like
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
I try to just take it in stride, and like,
Hmm.
there's always another job. And I think
Yeah.
like, talking about a home studio, sort of like a studio where you feel at home. I think personally for me, what's been really important is just not actually having a home studio as much as just like knowing that I'm sort of leasing my, what do you call it, like my skills to different studios. But at the end of the day, my home studio is me, and
Yeah.
it's when I go home, and
Hmm.
understanding that no company or no CEO or manager or whatever is really defining me, because that belongs to me. And
Yeah.
it sounds very like woo woo, but
No,
I think
no.
it's really important.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good way to phrase it. Is that you know your individual aspect of being an artist is something that studios can never really take away from you, and it's something that if you cling on to throughout your career will always help you find your way, and help you make decisions based on that. Because yeah, there can be multiple studios wanting to work with you, but then at the end of the day, you will always have to choose the studio that you find will work best for you as a person. And if you just take a job because of that pays really well, or they guys have really good reps, or have the next job will be even better. I think the guys I've found who have the most fulfilling careers have just followed their heart into things that they feel make them feel whole as an artist. Like it makes them just feel like a better person because they know they're feeding that artistic piece of their soul that really needs to be fed. And there's some guys I've seen who have said, I'll never work in 3D, and they never did. Some guys who have said, they say I should draw more realistically, but I don't want to, and I think if you stick to your guns in that respect and you always stay true to your artistic home, then yeah, you'll probably have a more fulfilling career than
Yeah.
probably just chasing a job constantly.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also helps that if you do have a negative experience, that doesn't define you as much. I feel like when you attach your identity to a company or a studio or a project,
Yeah,
and that maybe goes south, either for something in your control or out of your control,
yeah.
it doesn't define you. You just look at that as like, oh, well, that's something that went south, but that doesn't change who I am as a person.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think you're absolutely on the money there. And again, it's like I say, is if people listen to this, I always say when we kind of talk about these subjects is, yeah, don't feel disheartened and don't feel like, there isn't a future in certain industries. It's these things will happen in a lot of industries all over the planet, not even just in animation or even in
Yeah.
just entertainment. It's a thing that will be, especially when it comes to sexism or racism, it's a problem that every industry faces, not just animation and not just games. So, but it's good that I think we talk about it and we talk about it from the views of where you've came from as well, because then there will be also people who, a lot of women who will listen to this podcast that I know are always looking for the female perspective because, they're a young woman trying to get in the industry and they want to know what other women have went through. So it's always good to have this kind of talk because then they can more relate to it, as opposed to obviously if I have a male artist on who talks about his experience because they can't directly relate to it. But yeah, it's always good to have the other perspective because then it will make people think, oh no, but I do understand and I can relate to that because, they're also a female in the industry. So yeah, I think it's been a great talk overall, and I think it's something that there's so much to unpack, obviously, and there's so much to talk about. I feel like we could go on forever and ever, but yeah, we'll definitely have to try and get you back on at one point, Alison, and talk more about your experiences because yeah, an hour's just never long enough because you're trying to unpack years of somebody's career in less than 60 minutes. It's hard, right? Because there's so
Yeah.
many points, there's so much that you've done over the last couple of years that you probably want to dive into. So yeah. Is
Yeah.
that
Well,
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, so any kind of closing thoughts you feel like or advice you would want to give, and I think this will be more relevant, but any more particular advice you'd want to give like young women who are wanting to enter the industry or want to, kind of follow in your footsteps. Is there any kind of thing in particular you would want to say to them if they were listening?
Yeah, I guess advocate for yourself, and love yourself, and don't be afraid to set boundaries and expectations for yourself, because there's going to be a lot of people, whether they be companies or just people in general that want to take more from you than maybe you have the bandwidth to give. And honestly, this doesn't just apply to women. This applies to everyone.
Yeah, of course.
But just be your own advocate. I think a lot of people look for permission to advocate for themselves. They're like, oh, I can't advocate for myself until I get this good or I work at this company. And the fact of the matter is good things come to people who push for good things to happen to themselves. You can't ask for permission or wait for someone to acknowledge that you're deserving of the life that you want to live. You need to, advocate for that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's a great way to talk about it. It's a great way to end the show, but I think it's just a thing where the message has always just been, I think, especially the one I've tried to push as well, is the same one, is just be true to yourself and always hold on to that entire art's integrity and your own self-integrity and make sure that you're always looking after yourself. That's the main thing. So yeah, thanks very much to Allison again for coming on and giving up your time. It's been an absolute honour talking to you, and we definitely need to get you back at one point. If anybody has any questions for Allison, I'll leave her details below on our website. You can also leave a comment. I'm sure she'll get back to you at one point. And then, of course, stay tuned for the next Digital Artcast. We will be back at one point giving you awesome art talks. Thanks to Allison again, and we'll speak to you guys later. Bye.